Hello, everyone, and welcome to another debate in Shady Oak Ministries. Today's topic will be discussing and debating whether Europeans should worship a Jew. The participants are myself, Shady Oak Ministries, and Gyga Squid, who was gracious enough to take the negative position in this discussion. Shady Oak Ministries is a pastor from the United States, co-host of the Bible Question and Answer program, A Reason for Hope, as well as a direct descendant of Leif Erikson. He's taken the time to study Norse paganism and, as it's expressed in the modern day, as well as the primary earliest sources available to us. His position on the debate topic will be in the affirmative. Gyga Squid is a practicing Wotanist from Europe, and due to the nature of his controversial views, has requested anonymity, so his ideas and the merits therein are the sole factor by which they are considered. The purpose of this debate is not to promote one idea over the other, but to allow both ideas to be engaged upon on the basis of their merit from those willing to discuss them. Those who find the subject matter uncomfortable or even repulsive must do so from an informed perspective. You cannot claim someone is wrong or right because of their association with a certain group or worldview. I encourage everyone listening to be mature, allow even dissenting viewpoints to be spoken, and then, and only then, we will be able to come to conclusions as to why we agree or disagree with each other's views. These kinds of engagements are the only way that rational positions are formed. This format is also an open door for anyone else willing to objectively and rationally engage and present their positions in a way where we are both given the opportunity to actually do so. For the purposes of today's debate, the time schedule will be as follows. We will each be given 10 minutes for an opening statement. We'll be given 15 minutes for 2 rounds of rebuttals and 10 minutes for a closing statement. Each speaker is allowed to use whatever amount of the time that is allotted to them as they wish, and if they choose not to use the full amount of time, all the better for the length of the debate. We will appreciate your participation as well in the comments, and please be positive concerning the subject material, as well as gracious towards each individual, regardless of how passionately you disagree with their views. We look forward to this debate and encourage your participation, not only in future debates, but in this one as well.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Shady Oak Ministries for hosting me and for allowing me to debate today. I am grateful that you have given me a platform to debate someone who thinks differently than me, and I think this experience will definitely open one of our eyes, that's for sure. But I'm going to get right into it. And so I'm here today to debate my position on what the religion of the European and European descended peoples should practice. Why do we, as white men and women, worship a tan-skinned Jew? Our gods, our true gods, are white as snow, with hair as golden and pure as the sun herself. Our gods are warriors and poets, sorcerers and wise men. Jesus Christ is a weak God. That is undeniable and completely irrefutable. He was killed by our white Roman ancestors and hated by his own people, hated so much that they saw the need to convince our ancestors to nail him to a cross and mock him as their king. Divine power does not rest within the meek and the downtrodden, as the Bible, Christianity, Judaism would suggest. No, it resides within the blood of us, propagated by our ancestors and created by our gods, the gods that are Wotan and Thunar, Veles and Andraste, many more gods, just not those. The blood of our ancestors flows in the veins of our deities, the same deities that helped us build empires that spanned across the globe. The hallowed names of Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, Canute, those are not Jewish names, those are not Christian names. They do not come from the part of the world that Yahweh or Jesus Christ comes from. Those are strong, proud European names, whose roots extend beyond antiquity, survived through the ages by brothers and sisters of the fatherlands. The desert god of Jews has no powers in our pine forest. He does not rule our fjords and fields. He does not rule us. This foreigner will never rule us. No foreigner will ever rule us. No Arab, no African, no Jew, no Asian. Our blood, our soil, won for us through conquest thousands of years ago, inhabited by us for more than a millennia. I would sooner leap. I would apologize for speaking there, but I would sooner leap into a vat of lava than ever bend the knee to a foreign god. And I believe at our hearts, every European and every man whose blood extends from that which was grown in Europe feels the same way.
The Apostle Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus before his encounter with Jesus of Nazareth after his resurrection, was speaking to Europeans in the Areopagus in Athens, addressing their worship of the unknown God, and said the following. This is Acts 17 and verse 30. Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. As a Christian, that means I have come to the objective conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth was who he claimed to be, and that the historically documented actions he has done to verify those claims were sufficient. Those claims are as follows. The God of Israel exists, the Jewish Messiah was sent for the redemption of all nations, and that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah and God of Israel, who consciously chose to enter history as an ethnic Jew. The reasons for the first claim is that his identity and traits are clarified from the Jewish scriptures that Jesus of Nazareth taught from. Isaiah 42, 8 through 9 reads, I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. God in the Old Testament establishes credibility through prophecy. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3 states, In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. God is identified not only as Jesus in verse 14, but also the Creator before he became an ethnic Jew in what's called the Incarnation. And in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we read, God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, this is what's known as the Old Testament, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the worlds, see the previous point, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. The Jewish Messiah's being sent for the redemption of all nations is clarified in the biographies written by the eyewitnesses of his claims that they themselves, as well as the Jewish scriptures they believed, were authoritative in identifying God's nature. In Isaiah 42, 1 through 4, we read, Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my elect one in whom my soul delights. Elect one is another word for the Messiah, or the Christ in Greek. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the Gentiles, non-Jewish people. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench. He will bring forth justice for truth. He will not fail nor be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth. And the coastlands, that is, the foreign nations, shall wait for his law. In Matthew 28, verses 19 through 20, Jesus speaking to his disciples states, All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Therefore go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Amen. And in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, Paul the Apostle, speaking to a European audience, says, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. The third claim, Jesus of Nazareth being the Messiah, is stated that noting what makes Hebrew culture and Jewish ethnicity distinct, let alone superior to any other, isn't their genetics or appearance, but the fact that God spoke to and revealed himself through them. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 through 8, it reads, For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than all the people, for you were the least of all peoples, but because the Lord loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers. The Lord has brought you out with a strong hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. It's not the Jews' merit or strength, it is their gods and their gods alone. And finally, in Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 2, what advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision, a mark by which Jewish individuals are identified? Much in every way, chiefly to them were committed the oracles of God. Worship means to bow down or to recognize who someone is. Regardless of my ethnic heritage, if the God of Israel exists and his claims to be the only God in authority over all nations as their creator and sustainer are valid, then it is rational for all nations to acknowledge that fact based on the historical merit of those claims and the miracles performed to verify them, which we'll discuss more in the length of this debate. These include, but aren't limited to, over 500 documented eyewitnesses seeing him alive after his public execution by Roman crucifixion, as he predicted and his power overcame. For this reason, I, along with all those who recognize these historical claims as true, worship him as God, regardless of the fact that I am a Gentile or European.
So, you claim that your Lord chose to reveal himself through Jews simply does not make sense. Why would a God as powerful as one you claim your Lord to be use such a weak and sickly race? Why not choose to use such warriors as the Celts and Germanic berserkers, who are famed for their battle prowess and brutality? Could he have not spread his word faster with the help of an axe and sword? I ask you, what European ethnicity allowed itself to be genocided and massacred such as the Jews were? When we began the extermination of them and other degenerates, who in the entire world cared at the moment? Even the nations that took them down didn't care for the Jews and had been fighting for unrelated reasons. What have they accomplished in the Eurosphere as a whole? Does the number of Christians in the world not far surpass the number of Jews? More Europeans worship Yahweh than there are Jews in the world. Jews aren't even the ones to spread the word of Yahweh, the task instead being given to the likes of Theodosius I and Charlemagne. How many foreign invasions has Israel suffered through? If the Jews truly were the chosen ones, then wouldn't they at least be able to defend their homeland? The Jews supposedly are a weak race with a strong God, but we are a strong race with strong gods. Also, it is claimed by you that your Lord was prophesied to bring justice to the shores of all nations, but when is that to happen? Before the arrival of Jewkind to our shores, did we not have our own codes and laws? Did we not live in marble cities and forge empires? What is justice, if not Roman crucifixion of murderers, thieves, and rapists? What is civilization, if not Rome, Nidaros, and Kiev, cities which have stood for a millennium, and still stand to this day? We had justice and order. We had our gods, our strength, our power, and we had our justice. As for witnessing, how many men from antiquity claim to have witnessed gods such as Apollo and Poseidon? How many men from the 800s and 900s claim to have met Thor or Odin or Loki on mountain paths? According to Hellenistic myth, the entire city of Athens feasted their eyes upon the goddess Athena when she bestowed to them the olive tree. Do those witnesses not matter? What makes the Bible any more credible than oral tradition passed down since the beginning of our race? There are fewer witnesses to divinity in the entire Bible than in the myths of all European cultures combined. Alexander the Great ascended to godhood after his death, and fuel of his entire empire, which he almost single-handedly forged, still being worshipped to this day in the name cult of Alexander. Roman emperors were supposedly descended from gods, and yet are these claims discounted? Why? I do not understand why you choose to listen to the thousands of witnesses in the Bible when there have been millions of witnesses to our gods and our European peoples. I just do not understand.
My opponent's quote stated that my Lord revealed himself through the Jews does not make sense. The reasons for this was because the Jews allegedly are weak and sickly, and that better options were available to him, like the Celts, berserkers, and that he could have better spread his word easier through axe and sword. None of these reasons disqualify God's capacity to enter this world as whatever ethnicity he wishes. Even if it's acknowledged that better options were available to him, the necessary factor that's required for God to reveal himself is for there to be a God, not for that God to choose the most efficient gene line. In fact, the God of Israel told Israel his reasons for revealing himself to them apart from the other nations. The answer wasn't utilitarian, meaning the most useful. It was the fact that he had made their ancestors a promise he would keep. This was addressed in the third point in my opening statement, Deuteronomy 7, verses 6 through 8. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. Now listen, the Lord did not set his love on you or choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples, but because the Lord loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers, and goes on to mention the Exodus. Regarding the use of violence being an easier way to spread his message, I'll withhold comment and allow us both to be grateful the God of Israel is more gracious and patient than our ancestors were. The statement was made when the Jews were being exterminated. Who cared? The Allies. And it's worth noting the observation that sentiment was taken from used the Armenians as a similar point of comparison. I have to note that the lack of empathy on the part of humanity towards Muslim or Nietzsche-inspired genocides hold no sway on whether or not Europeans should worship a Jew. If you're bringing up the moral problem of evil as an objection towards there being a God, this applies equally towards the existence of pagan deities as well. If the argument is that the Jewish God can't exist because evil was allowed to take place, I can apply this more forcefully towards your belief in the Germanic and Nordic deities, whenever atrocities were committed in their lands, and there were plenty. If you want to have this discussion as an atheist, we can discuss the philosophical problems with this presumption. However, as you stand, you can't make this claim and consistently remain a pagan. Quote, what have they accomplished in the Eurosphere? Once again, utilitarianism isn't a metric by which the existence of something is established. You can have better ideas about how you think something ought to be, and one of two things can be happening. You could either fail to understand its original purpose, or you'd be admitting the key detail that that thing still does exist. For the sake of time, I will give examples if necessary, but for now, let's just go on to the point. If my objection to God being worthy of worship is because of his interactions with Israel, I have to wonder how much would be accomplished if we wasted time addressing hypotheticals regarding what could have been done anywhere else. The question of this debate isn't to write a historical fan fiction about what would or could have been. The question is, should Europeans worship a Jew? This assumes that if there's a God, he's worthy of worship. If it's the God of Israel, then ethnicity is irrelevant. The same is true for the pagan deities. I'm not going to waste time or energy asking if the European gods were at work in India or the Aztec gods were at work in China. All that's necessary for the debate to address is if there is a God, which we both agree, and the question is, which has proven themselves as such in history, not which locations they've impacted by a superficial metric I'd assume nobody could objectively judge. If I were to mention the introduction of hospitals and orphanages to European culture, you could just say that's not good enough. I'd rather stay on topic than engage in a discussion that ends where our debate isn't. The quote was made, the number of Christians surpassed the number of Jews, and you gave the historical example of Theodosius and Charlemagne spreading the word of Yahweh more than Jews have. My response to that would be, great. I'm glad there's more people in history that agree with the position I've taken in this debate. I'm not sure how the fact that great and successful Europeans affirming the worship of a Jew is an argument against my position. Quote, if the Jews were the chosen ones, wouldn't they be able to defend their homeland? That depends on what you expect from God. If the way you define God is some supernatural wall that keeps enemies at bay, the God of Israel can accomplish more than you realize. When the Assyrians threatened Jerusalem in the 8th century BC, during the reign of King Hezekiah, we have documentation in Isaiah 38 and archaeological verification of this in the British Museum, the Taylor Prism, which records the annals of King Sennacherib of the Assyrians. When they threatened Jerusalem, they historically verify that an 185,000 strong army was wiped out in one night. Isaiah obviously identifies this as the God of Israel. The Sennacherib prism verifies this as the army disappearing in one night without explanation or desire to admit when they lost a battle. If you read the accounts of Jeremiah, Daniel, and Matthew, you'll find that Israel falling to the Babylonians and Romans was predicted in advance as a direct result not of God's impotence, but Israel separating themselves from their God. However, all of this is secondary to the real issue at hand. God's worthiness to be worshipped isn't determined by the establishing of borders of the number of conquests. The reason I worship God is because, as stated in Deuteronomy, he keeps his promises, including but not limited to the preservation of the Jewish people through untold persecution and opposition throughout human history. Hold God to his standards. Don't make up metrics that he never held himself to and then condemn him by them. That is fallacious reasoning. Quote, referencing Isaiah 42's fulfillment, when is that to happen? It's a messianic prophecy in reference to the end times. Much like in Norse paganism's recordings of Ragnarok, it's something unfulfilled in the future. If you deny the possibility of prophecies, understand that cuts both ways. Also note, I'll point you back to the point I was being made in the opening statement. The Jewish Messiah was sent for the redemption of all nations, not just the Jews. So, citing Matthew and Romans as evidence of this in Christian doctrine, quoting Jesus and his followers will hopefully clarify that point. You made the point that the entire city of Athens feasted their eyes on Athena when she bestowed upon them the olive tree, and you asked, do those witnesses not matter? Your source on that claim is an interesting one. What makes a witness matter is based on three historical factors. Primary sources, were they the ones who actually saw the events take place or had direct association with the eyewitnesses themselves? Hostile sources, do the enemies or those in opposition to those claims acknowledge key details that are crucial to those accounts? You don't admit to something that never happened. And then finally, multiple attestation. Do you have a bare minimum of two independent sources that report the same essential details about the event? The reason for these standards in historical criticism is fairly straightforward. The sooner the reports are to the events they report, the less time there is for embellishment. Anyone can slam a trident into the ground or plant an olive tree, or in the case of Athena's olive tree, have it burned to the ground by the Persians in 480 BC, replanted, destroyed again in World War II, and rebuilt by the Queen Sophia of Spain in 1952. The people who were there could clarify if it was a battle of the gods over who would have the city dedicated to them, but I don't even have to go there. Not only do we have no other sources that report this battle between Athena and Poseidon, but the earliest possible source for this event are the hymns of Proclus, who was a Neoplatonist philosopher who lived from 412 to 485 AD. That's 400 years after the time of Jesus, and as well, potentially thousands of years after the events he writes about, and that's assuming it took place to begin with. No eyewitnesses, no hostile confirmation, and no secondary sources that affirm this. The earliest we have is 400 years after this event. After my event, rather. There is no reason to trust those witnesses because those witnesses didn't write the history. The 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, on the other hand, documents a hymn dated to within months of the resurrection, naming 3 people by name and documenting 500 people at one time seeing Jesus of Nazareth alive after his death. The names are Peter, who is nicknamed Cephas, James, and Paul, along with his disciples. Can I get the name of 2 people that could be tested to have actually seen Athena, let alone attest to the fact that she's a superior goddess of wisdom and war to the god documented as a warrior in Exodus and the source of all wisdom in Proverbs? Quote, what makes the Bible any more credible than oral tradition? As stated before, oral tradition can't be tested. We just have to take the word of the most recent orator in the hope that that was what was originally spoken. The Bible has been written down from 1450 BC to 90 AD, with more documentation to support it than any other work of ancient writing. With over 6,000 copies in the original Greek, 10,000 in Latin and other languages translated from the original, and under the level of scrutiny that could only be provided by atheists and skeptics alike, to this day, all of the changes that have even been translated to account for, or that amount to rather, only about 1/2 of one page of text. And even ardent modern skeptics like Bart Ehrman acknowledges in the appendix of his book Misquoting Jesus, documenting these changes, that, quote, no major doctrine of Christianity is changed by any of these problem passages. You said there are fewer witnesses in identity in the entire Bible than in the myths of all European cultures combined. I think there's a confusion regarding the number of believers and the number of witnesses. A witness isn't a character in a story. A witness isn't a name that is mentioned. For example, I don't name Moses or the 3 to 5 million Israelites that followed him in the wilderness as witnesses of the Exodus on the level of historical criticism. I don't deny they exist, but I can't examine them critically, so I'm not going to use them as a point. I can, however, examine the witnesses of Jesus' death and resurrection, which modern skeptics like James Dominic Crossan acknowledge as one of the most verifiable facts of ancient history, just regarding his death. What I can test, I test. What I can't test, I don't call witnesses. And then you said that thousands versus millions of witnesses are available, comparing the Bible to paganism. Once again, this is a fallacious misrepresentation of what it means to be a witness. We don't compare quantities. We ask for quality. I can use the historical attestation and credibility of one of the Gospels to outpace the credibility of every single pagan source combined. That includes Hinduism, Egyptian, Greek, and Norse paganism. However, the topic of the debate isn't the historical credibility of the pagan sources. My case is that Jesus is worthy of worship regardless of his ethnicity, because God is worthy of worship, and only Jesus of Nazareth has made an actual case for being God. With about 2 minutes left in the time span, I'll relinquish the rest of my time, but I'm looking forward to the rebuttal to these statements, and once again, thank you for the time.
So, to start off, I would like to address the topic of the Jews. Now, one of the Allied nations went to war with Germany because the Jews were suffering. The Americans went in because Germany declared war on them after the Americans declared war on Japan in response to Pearl Harbor. The British went in to protect Poland, so did the French, and Russia went in because it was attacked. Not one nation cared for them, despite the camps being an open secret. Many countries, including my own, supported Germany's actions during the war, and even went as far as feeding his camp Jews to eat off of. Metaphorically, of course. Also, were the Armenians not Christian? Were they not promised justice? Next, I think you may have misinterpreted my argument. I do not argue whether or not your Lord exists, for I do not know, and that is not the topic of the debate. The topic of the debate is whether or not white Europeans should worship the God of Israel. I do not argue that if he did exist, then evil shouldn't exist. I know that evil exists, and I'm not claiming that the existence of your Lord is disproven by this fact. I argue that the fact that your Lord is the supposed bringer of peace, and yet there's no peace, should disqualify him from our worship. Not that it should disqualify him from being real, but simply that we should not worship him because his promise has been left unkept. The true European gods have not promised anything and are therefore not held to the same oath of peace that your Lord is. Your God promised peace and did not deliver. It is that simple. My gods promise nothing and thus have nothing to deliver. I do not know or care to know what gods govern the lands of India, Southeast Asia, and South America, but I do know which gods govern the white European lands obtained either by birthright or conquest. The next argument, that your Lord is weak because the Jews are weak, is in fact related to the question of whether or not we should worship him. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he claims that the Jews are his people. He does not claim us. He does not claim Asians or blacks. And God's people is a reflection on him and his strength. Your Lord is weak because the Jews are weak. If your God was stronger or wiser than my gods, then would he have not chosen a more superior people? Perhaps we have a different understanding, but the gods are not omnipotent. They cannot exist physically in more than one place at a time. Now, metaphorically, they can reside within the hearts of all non-Semitic whites, but I'll digress from that. As for the source, I will admit that you might have me there. The time that the tale of how Athens received its name is ancient, so ancient in fact that it is speculated to have been first told in the Mycenaean era, forgive me, and to have happened back when the Indo-Europeans were still relatively new to the area. It should be noted, however, that the lack of verifiable source does not mean it did not happen. As an easy example today, I killed a bug. There is no source other than me to confirm this, and yet I did. Perhaps some sources were lost to history, perhaps the tale was metaphorical, but the fact that my ancestors were not literate enough to write down a source proves nothing. Also, can the Bible be trusted any more than oral tradition? Anyone can write down anything. Using a similar example to the prior example I used, I could write down on a piece of paper that a giant flying spaghetti monster of anything appeared before me today, and it being written down numerous times by people around me, and then if we were to distribute these witness accounts across the globe, does not make it true. Also, forgive me. This, I believe, was a miscommunication on my part, however, because I think we have a different definition of what a God is. You being a Christian, you likely believe that your God is omnipotent, and I do not think that. I believe that the gods are not entirely physical, and thus, to me, anyone who's truly felt the gods is a witness. A witness to a non-physical being can be anyone. What Asatru, or paganism, really is just animism. Only LARPers believe that the gods are physical sky daddies zooming around in space or the sky. The point of worshipping our gods is as much an ethnic pride as it is a spiritual one. Yes, we worship these gods to appease the energies they represent, but we also worship them because they are our gods. They originate here on the continent, they manifest themselves as white Europeans, and, most importantly, they represent the spirit of Europe. A people is nothing without its gods. Gods give us purpose. Gods drive us to breed and make more white Europeans. They drive us to genocide lesser races like the Jews or African Negroes. They give us the strength to dominate those who would oppose us. I like your God, I truly do, but he is a multicultural deity. An Asian, an African, hell, a Muslim even, can all become Christians and thus become equal under the eyes of your Lord. And I refuse to share a God with degenerates who would see my beautiful country and my beautiful continent fall into disgusting Arabic degeneracy.
You made a clarification. The Allies all involved themselves in World War II for reasons that had nothing to do with the Holocaust. I'll repeat my point. I have to note the lack of empathy on the part of humanity towards Muslim or Nietzsche-inspired genocides hold no sway on whether or not Europeans should worship a Jew. You said, quote, if your Lord is the supposed bringer of peace, and yet there is no peace, that should disqualify him from our worship. Not that it should disqualify him from being real, glad we understand that, but simply that we should not worship him because his promise has been left unkept. I think there's a misunderstanding on what constitutes a promise. The word promise is a term used to describe something in the future tense. Unless a time limit is placed on the promise, it's not a failure. It's an assurance of its end. We determine someone's ability to keep their promises based on their reputation of keeping prior promises, not the preferred speed at which they fulfill them. For example, if a promise of a birthday gift fails because your birthday came and went and no present was given, that's a failed promise because the birthday is the set time period. If the God of Israel promises peace, you have to first ask, when did he promise it? That wasn't specified. And how did he promise it? Is it peace with all nations, or is it peace with him? And in what order? That is also worth noting. His peace is promising peace with him before peace with everyone else. You said, quote, the European gods have not promised anything and therefore are not held to the same oath of peace that your Lord is. Once again, I'm not sure what is meant by oath of peace. If you have words my God spoke to hold against him, then cite him. If your argument is only vague accusations, then understand that's not going to be an effective argument. It won't be in your favor because you can't point to where those oaths have been made, and it's not to my detriment since the standard of God's worthiness to be worshipped aren't determined by your expectations. We just have to establish the fact that he is, in fact, God. If you have a challenge against those claims, then don't hold him to your standards, examine him according to his. That's why I stick to the poetic Eddas and the traditions passed down from our ancestors, as well as the Jewish scriptures that reveal the character of God, not just my preferences on what I think a God should be like. You said, I don't know what gods govern the white European lands obtained I do know what gods govern the white European lands obtained through either birthright or conquest. Do you now? If, as you stated, they aren't literal beings or understood as anything apart from the feelings or experiences of those who inhabit these lands, what happens when the lands of our ancestors are taken over by a foreign invader, or our ancestors, through some unfortunate circumstance, die out? Do the gods of those lands die out with them, or do they remain what they are, regardless of who's living in their respective borders? Understand, the question is worthiness. Do your gods cease to exist, or do they remain what they are, regardless of who or where they're worshipped? Conquest implies something taken by another. Birthright implies something owned before you. Both of those things can be taken away. Gods that can cease to be based on politics or circumstance are not worthy of worship, because one day they may in fact cease to exist. You were clarifying the context of my Lord being weak because the Jews are weak by stating, your Lord does not claim us, that is, Europeans. A God's people is a reflection of his strength. Actually, he does. In the book of Acts chapter 17, verses 24 through 31, we're given a Christian definition of God, and the Apostle Paul speaking does so to an audience of Europeans on Mars Hill. Note how the weakness of God surpasses any feat performed in Norse tradition by Ymir, Odin, Tyr, and Thor combined. In Acts 17 and verse 24 we read, God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything. Since he gives to all life, breath, and all things, he is made from one blood, not many bloods, not blood determined by borders or ethnicity or appearance, one blood, every nation of men, to dwell on the face of all the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord. That's the purpose, and the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said. Remember, he's speaking to a Greek audience. He quotes the Greek poem written by Epimenides, originally referring to Zeus, but he applies it to Yahweh. For we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and men's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men, everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. Now you understand my argument. If you want a weak God, see one that requires worship and worshipers. If you want a mighty God, look at the God of Israel. He created the universe and everything in it. He's the one to whom we all owe our existence. He's the one who has shown us all mercy for the crimes we've committed against him. And now he calls us to turn back to him with proof of his majesty by conquering death itself. He's not bound by a weird like Odin. He isn't under the authority of the Norns. He's beyond anything man has ever conjured by himself. Greater than any Jew, European, or anyone else. That sounds worthy of recognition, whether we want to participate or not. You noted the context and clarification of acknowledging poor evidence for Athena and Poseidon's existence, which is good, but you said the lack of verifiable source does not mean it did not happen. And then, I'll note parenthetically, you suggested perhaps some sources were lost to history. You can't verify inconsequential things like kill a bug, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Evidence isn't examined by negatives. I can argue the same and say the undeniable proof of the God of Israel's worthiness to be worshipped, exists. You just haven't seen it yet. Do I then claim victory over the debate's topic because of a claim over something you haven't seen? Of course not. We need evidence for things we actually have. If there's no reason to conclude the only historical evidence you've provided for gods, apart from the God of Israel, isn't historical, then that remains in my favor, and the point still stands. If the God of Israel exists, and has demonstrated that with verifiable data, including but not limited to a resurrection from the dead, with over 500 documented eyewitnesses to boot, then I'm the only one here with that kind of evidence to support his worthiness to be worshipped. A non-existent God isn't worthy of worship. A God who's proven his existence is. I'm sure we can agree on that. You said, quote, "Is the Bible any less reliable than oral tradition? Can anyone write down anything they want to?" You noted the example of the flying spaghetti monster appearing to you and then circulating it. Yes, oral tradition is less reliable for the same reason historical evidence is more reliable than hypotheticals. I can test the reliability of the Bible's transmission and understand what the claims were about this God, note, going as far back to the eyewitnesses themselves as evidence. I'm not claiming to prove whether it's true or false. I'm noting that if I want to know what the eyewitnesses themselves said, that is how I can test it. Also note the worthiness of the European gods. Who would be better to hear from than the people who saw them for themselves? I want to go back to the original sources, not take the word of the most recent person reiterating what they heard and not being able to test whether what they heard was actually the original document, or, for that matter, borrowed from Christians or embellished. I can't know whether or not the ways I'm worshiping these gods is actually what they are. I have to assume my own ability to be misguided, this is the key, apart from personal revelation. That's why I depend on the most well-attested source of revelation given in human history. I'd rather assume my error than hope in my reliability. It's also worth noting that if I make up a hypothetical scenario where I imitate the behavior of the resurrection's eyewitnesses, the root of that event is not only founded upon a lie, but it didn't actually happen. We're not here to play what-ifs. We need to know what is. The compiler of the Eddas wasn't a witness to the Norse gods, nor the direct recipients of these traditions and rituals. The authors of the Bible actually were. Go with the data we have. Don't play red herring games that pretend something that didn't happen ultimately disproves the reliability of what actually did. You said, quote, "We have a different understanding of what a God is. I agree. I believe God is something that exists and is therefore worthy of worship. And just so there's no misunderstanding about what worship means to bow down, like recognizing the authority of a king. We're simply asking if that thing is worth being recognized for what it is." You said, "Anyone who feels the gods is a witness." Feelings aren't a good metric for anything. I can be lied to, manipulated, or misdirected based on my feelings. I can feel like a girl is flirting with me, but if I fail to take into consideration, maybe she's just being friendly or just doing her job and making a positive atmosphere for her customers, I can be misled based on my feelings and misperceive that interaction. But if, on the other hand, I want to understand what the actual goal is, I don't just stop at feelings. I don't exclude them, but I don't stop at them. I need to ask more questions than how I feel, especially when it comes to what I worship. You said, quote, that asatru is animism, which was clarifying the context of the previous statement. I'm glad we've clarified your perspective on the matter. The point still stands regarding the God of Israel. Do you regard nature because of the souls within them, or the one who created their souls to begin with? Animism isn't a religious worldview. It's a perspective on nature having a spiritual component to it. You still have to ask where those things came from, let alone if your perception of them is accurate. You said, quote, only LARPers believe in physical sky daddies zooming around in space or the sky. I'm fascinated you use the word sky daddy to refer to a literal deity. That's a shorthand term that was popularized by a Jew named Sigmund Freud in his book, The Future of an Illusion, who took the inspiration from Ludwig Feuerbach in believing that all religion, asatru and paganism included, are merely forms of wish fulfillment for a father figure in authority over nature. The problem is this actually proves my point further. If the only ground I've stood upon is historical evidence for the existence of a literal God, and your primary evidence is your feelings, then our two witnesses fly in the face of both of their false presuppositions. Their assumption is that there is no other explanation for God apart from human psychology. My argument hasn't mentioned my own perception or experiences once. If you want a good response to the psychological problems with this attitude towards religion as a whole, I'd recommend The Faith of the Fatherless by Paul Vitz. You said, quote, the point of belief in our gods is as much of ethnic pride as it is a spiritual one. Fun. The point of belief in my God is because he's real and has made himself known. Ethnicity has nothing to do with it, and I'm thankful for that. The preservation of my ethnicity, or my perception of it, are too unstable a foundation to establish the way I live my life and why, let alone how I view my origins and ultimate destiny, which are tied into my theology. You said, quote, a people is nothing without its gods. Gods give us purpose. They cause us to breathe and make more white Europeans. They drive us to genocide, lesser races, like the Jews or African Negroes. They give us the strength to dominate those who would oppose us. I'm glad we were able to have this conversation. Everyone here is getting the chance to see what kind of impact our beliefs have on us over time. I appreciate your honesty, regardless of how repulsive I find your conclusions and justifications for genocide. But understand, my God offers far more than just killing other gods or promoting white Europeans. In the Gospel of John, chapter 10 and verse 10, Jesus of Nazareth speaking says, the thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come, by contrast, that they may have life and may have it more abundantly. You said, quote, I like your God, but he is a multicultural deity. An Asian, African, a Muslim even, can become equal under the eyes of your Lord. Precisely, every nation has their honor and all are welcome in his kingdom, but what I'm sensing is that the honor of these nations includes the flaws that they would share and the views they would share with you. Islam isn't the honor of the Arab or African nations. It's a blight that I'd be happy to discuss more in the future. But if you'd like to know the difference between a Muslim and a Christian, I'd recommend looking up the Ministries of Al-Fadi and the testimony of Nabil Qureshi. Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus is where he wrote that down. And finally, you said, quote, I refuse to share a God with degenerates who would see my beautiful country and my beautiful continent fall into discussing Arabic degeneracy. With the time I have left, I wouldn't want to either if sharing a God was limited to just believing about something without making an impact on my own degeneracy. The key isn't to what kind of monsters the Allah of Muhammad or Shiva produce. The question is whether Jesus of Nazareth was who he claimed to be, and the evidence is sufficient to conclude that. Those who can genuinely live in light of those truths will be exposed to more than just a feeling. We're talking about a God who can change the hearts of people from juvenile rapists and murderers like their prophet into someone like the God I worship. As a Christian, the reasons required for belief in God are given in Hebrews 11:6. Those who believe in God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. As stated earlier, the primary evidence for God's existence and therefore worthiness to be worshipped are primarily found in the historical evidence he's provided for him being it. Also note as well that if, regarding your question, Wotan were to demonstrate his existence historically on the same level that Yahweh has, two things would happen. First, I would equally regard Wotan as a valid deity worthy of worship as Yahweh, but he would also then, by his existence, falsify what Yahweh stated, in that there are no other gods apart from him, thus disqualifying himself from being worthy of worship. My beliefs can be falsified, they just have to pass not only historical muster, but be consistently applied.
Well, earlier in the argument, I stated that a god's power and strength as a deity is, what's the word I'm looking for? Reflected on him by the people that serve him. It is the same way for ethnicity and race. Yahweh, or your Lord, I don't know how to address him in a respectful manner, so I apologize, but he likely looks like the people that worship him, or the original ethnic people that worshipped him, so tan-skinned Jews who spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. Japanese gods look Japanese, Chinese gods look Chinese, Native American gods look Native American, and thus European gods, namely Germanic gods, will look Germanic.
Yes, and here's why. God's worthiness to be worshipped isn't like determining the fun of a multiplayer online game. It's only as fun as the people that you're playing it with. God's worthiness to be worshipped is based on whether or not he is what he is. And if the Christian God is the creator of everything, and his existence can be verified historically, then regardless of the participants or your opinions of them therein, it's not a matter of these people and the God that they associate themselves with. It's the God that we associate ourselves with and the impact that has on us. The changes to the God don't take place in the participants. The participants hopefully will change in light of the nature of that God. You can have Arabs, or what I think you're referring to are Muslims, who don't know a single thing about their prophet and will naturally not end up becoming more like him in their behavior. Likewise, there are Christians who wouldn't know Jesus from their left foot and will live their lives accordingly.
I find this question kind of hard to answer, mainly because there's no true and proper, there's no proper way to worship a god, and whether or not it matters to the true European gods, I cannot ask, I cannot answer, because I, of course, am not a god, but the true way to worship these gods has been lost probably forever in time and history, and all we have is bits and pieces of the way they supposedly did it. And for now, that will have to suffice.
The answer is no, because Jesus stated in John chapter 4 and verse 24, speaking to a non-Jewish woman, that God is seeking those to worship him in spirit and in truth. While I appreciate the fact that you want to acknowledge the spiritual aspect of God as being, and of course, therefore, being worthy of worship, there are other truth statements that need to be taken into consideration if you acknowledge that the God of Israel is in fact a true and living God, because he makes statements like Isaiah 43 and verse 10 that state, "There is no other God before me or after me." Likewise, in Luke chapter 6 and verse 46, the acknowledgement of him as Lord, worthy of worship, would mean that you would do the things that he tells you to. And if he tells you, like we read in Psalm 96 and verse 5, that the gods of the nations are idols, literally nothings, they are not worthy of worship. God would have more for you than to worship things that don't exist, that can't help you or hurt you. That's the reason why he is an exclusive religion, because truth matters.
I do not worship any god for spiritual truth. I worship them for cultural reasons. I don't care what Jesus preaches. I care about that he is part of European culture, whether I like it or not. So, yes, I'll worship the old God, but at the same time, I'll also worship the new God. There's no reason, nowhere is it written, that I can't worship both the old and the new at the same time.
It's not a matter of comfortable as it is capable and consistent. I can't claim to worship a God and at the same time ignore what he said. Luke 6:46 and Isaiah 43:10 would be a start on this topic. I also don't want to treat God like he's an object of value, that if I collect more of him, then suddenly I have better beliefs. More doesn't equal better beliefs when it comes to your foundation for truth and ethics. It just means that I don't take the one with the most evidence to support it seriously. Truth matters. Either one is right or both are wrong. Both can't be right when you read the claims that are made by the God of Israel. Concerning a foreign God, remember that the God of Israel revealed himself not to be bound by physical borders. The books of Ezekiel and 1 Kings both talk about God not being contained by a temple and just as present in Babylon as he was in Israel. Regarding a foreign land, understand that we both believe that our true homeland isn't in this world, but with our gods. The question isn't which nationality I belong to, but whether or not I actually belong to a God whose existence and worthiness to be worshipped I have reason to trust beyond my emotions and my opinions. It all comes back to that concerning my contentment. If the God of Israel is real, then he's sovereign over every nation, like he said, not just Israel's borders or nationality. His rules and nature are revealed to us through Scripture, and it's on that basis I understand and inform my reasons for trusting him, as well as test them.
We know who ought and ought not be worshiping them, because in order to worship them, you must be of European descent or blood. This is because the original people who worshipped them were of European descent or blood. Their divinity only seems to work for people of European descent. It does not work for others. It is, what's an analogy I can use? The same way that a fish breathes water and does not walk on land. You would not try and breathe in water if you were not a fish, so why should someone who is not from Europe try and worship our goods?
I want to thank my opponent for taking the time to address this topic and the candor at which he addressed the issues presented. As I stated in my opening, God's worthiness of worship is based on whether or not his existence as God can be demonstrated. The God of Israel has demonstrated his existence, and therefore he is worthy of worship. Over the course of this debate, his existence was never challenged, only the inferiority of the Jewish people through whom he revealed himself. However, as you probably noticed, this doesn't diminish his existence, only the emotional association with that deity, not the deity himself. In the rebuttal period, evidence was presented and subsequently disproven regarding the existence of gods other than the God of Israel. Athena and Poseidon's squabble over Athens wasn't recorded by any primary sources, whereas the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth was. A trident mark and an olive tree that's been burned down and replanted 3 times doesn't hold a candle to the 4 eyewitness sources concerning the historical resurrection from the dead, including 500 documented eyewitnesses to verify it, all codified within months of the original event, affirmed by Christians and atheists alike. During the Q&A session, clarification was provided concerning the standards by which my opponent determines the worthiness of gods to be worshipped. And as we all heard, it was entirely on the basis of his own opinion. It didn't come from Odin's oral traditions. It wasn't revealed to him through the Druids or any reliable source of spiritual authority. It was himself. I can't test his opinions, nor could they have been applied consistently since they're unfalsifiable. My opinions, however, aren't opinions. They are statements established in history and, of course, are completely falsifiable. If you can establish the existence of a God other than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then his status as God is invalidated because he violated his own nature. That hasn't been provided. Likewise, if we're put in a position where not only the statements of God can be falsified or the status of God can be challenged, but every single attempt to do so had failed. The only way, and again, this is the key to this, the only way that I can determine what is or isn't worthy of worship is if there is a right and a wrong answer for how to do so. If there's no wrong way to how you worship, there's no substance to the objects you're choosing to worship. For example, you're taking a test where there is no wrong answer. A person who just writes the letter A is just as correct as the person who writes a complete sentence, and also just as valid as someone who writes a coherent sentence providing an answer to the topic. I would want higher standards for spiritual truths than someone whose literal nonsense would just as much be as valuable as someone who was presenting something coherent and something substantive. I'm not saying that my opponent's position is nonsensical, but I am saying that if your standard is that the answers we provide have no ultimate or final authority as to whether they're right or wrong, then there's nothing really worth it compared to your views and mine. My view is that there is a right answer, that there is a substance behind the reasons why I choose to worship God in this way as opposed to others. And this is the key. When it comes to disunity in the Christian church regarding the nature of God, there isn't any. When it comes to disunity concerning the nature of God and how we understand him, there isn't any. But if, on the other hand, we're going to go into secondary details, that's an entirely different debate topic. The point being made is this. If there is no right answer, then there's also no wrong answer. But if there is no wrong answer or right answer, then why even ask the question? That's the whole point of this debate. Not only in asking a question, should Europeans worship a Jew, but noting the point as well, if God has demonstrated his existence, then who cares what ethnicity he revealed and incarnated himself through and from? My opponent, again, has no problem acknowledging the God of Israel exists and is fully aware of how he ought to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. The same can't be said for his gods. They provide about as many standards for how they're to be understood or honored as they do historical evidence for their existence. If I recognize a God for who he is, the definition of worship, I'd at least ask them to reveal how. A fake Odin, Thor, Tyr, Freya, etc., would be just as meaningless as if I were to honor a fake Yahweh. So note that point. I would apply my standards to other religions, and I would at least allow other religions to present their standards, which unfortunately in this case there are none. The fundamental disagreement discovered during this debate was rooted in the standards we bring towards what a god ought to be. As my opponent stated, if a god's worthiness is determined by and limited to his people, then the God of Israel would pass every single standard, regardless of your opinion of the Jewish people. The culture of the Jewish people has endured without a unified homeland for 2,000 years, despite every law of cultural anthropology. That shows that the God this nation is associated with is at least not bound by borders. They remain a stalwart military force, despite constant invasion, infiltration, and international slander from Muslims, and only sporting territory larger than the state in the United States of New Jersey. And as a reflection of their God's promises and character, they're not going anywhere, regardless of the universal attempts on their existence, going all the way back to the Exodus of Egypt. But all of this is moot, given the fact that the object of today's debate is focusing on God and his worthiness, not his followers. A bad follower isn't going the same direction as their example. A good follower of a bad example is just as lost as they are. Have higher standards for who you choose to follow and recognize as worthy of following. Mine are based on history, prophecy, and even playing by your rules, his faithfulness to the Jewish people. I'd recommend the same to everyone listening, not because of your opinions towards a particular ethnicity, but because the promises he's kept to the Jews prove he'll also keep his promises to you. And if you want to know what these promises are and how to benefit from them, look no further than the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, which is stated to be relevant to us as well in the Gospel of John chapter 11, verses 25 through 26. The historical context of this was concerning two women who were mourning the death of their older brother Lazarus, and Jesus comforting the elder of the two sisters by the name of Martha. He clarifies to her after she says, "I know that my brother will live again at the resurrection, at the last day, but I'm grieving now." Jesus' response to her is telling. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." I repeat the words of my Lord. Do you believe this? Thank you again for joining us all in this debate, and God bless you.
In closing, I believe that all of my questions were answered, and hopefully I answered all of yours. I would like to apologize that it took a long time for this video and this debate to be completed, but as I told you when we were making it, there's a lot happening in my life, unfortunately, at the moment. Thank you very much for allowing me to debate with you, and I respect you and I respect your viewpoints, and I even found myself agreeing on a few of them. It is very rare that I find someone who I disagree with who is willing to have a debate and discussion with me. Hopefully you feel the same with me, and I think that about closes it up. Thank you.